The Last Fever. A Story of Hope and Delusion in the Klondike, 1898. The mule died on the third day out of Skagway. Elias Croft stood over the animal in the blue-gray light of an Alaskan morning and did not weep, though he had owned the creature for 11 years and had named it after his mother. He simply looked at it for a long time, the stiffened legs, the open eye still holding its last expression of dumb suffering. And then he unstrapped his pack from the saddle frame and hoisted it onto his own back. The pack weighed nearly 90 pounds. He was 60 years old. He started walking. That was how most things had gone in Elias Croft's life. Something died, and he kept walking. He had come late to the rush, as he had come late to most things. The news of the Klondike strike had reached Sacramento in the summer of 1897. Carried by steamships dumping sun-darkened men onto the docks with their pokes fat with dust. And Elias had read about it in the newspaper at the barber shop where he went every 2 weeks to get his white hair trimmed. The other men in the waiting chairs had laughed and spoken of fools. Elias had said nothing. He had folded the paper along its crease and set it back on the pile and walked home. And that night he had lain awake, listening to the creak of the house in the wind, and thought about it for a very long time. He told no one of his plans until they were made. That, too, was his way. His daughter Maren had cried when he told her. She was 32, married to a solid man who worked the Sacramento Valley orchards, and she had her mother's practical eyes. "Papa," she said, in the voice she used when speaking to someone who did not fully understand the world. "You are 60 years old. I know how old I am. The passes will kill you. People are dying. Young men are dying. Young men die everywhere," Elias said. "At least up there they die trying for something." That had been the wrong thing to say. She had turned away from him and busied herself with the dishes, and they had not spoken warmly again before he left. He carried the weight of that silence north with him, heavier in some ways than the pack. He had spent 30 years working other men's claims, other men's ranches, other men's dreams, a hired hand to ambition rather than a practitioner of it. And now he was old and had little to show for it except a rented house, a mule that had died before him, and a daughter who looked at him the way people look at something broken that they have given up trying to fix. But there was this. Deep in the chest of every man who has ever worked the earth for metal or mineral or oil, there lives a fever. It is not quite greed, though greed is part of it. It is not quite hope, though hope is its language. It is something older and more unreasonable. The conviction, irrational and unkillable, that beneath the next hill, in the next valley, under the next cold stream, the world has been saving something for you specifically. That your name is written on a vein of gold somewhere, and all you have to do is find it. Elias Croft had carried that fever for 40 years. In the California diggings of 49, he had been a boy of 11 watching men go mad with it. In the Comstock years, he had swung a pick in the Nevada heat and come out with wages. In Colorado, in Idaho, in the played-out creek beds of a dozen territories, he had followed the fever like a compass needle follows north. And now, at 60, with his body beginning to say things to him in the mornings that it had never said before, the biggest strike in history had come roaring out of the Yukon like a last gift. And he had looked at it and thought, "This is mine." Whether that was hope or delusion, he could not have said. Perhaps it was both. Perhaps at 60, those two things collapse into each other and become indistinguishable. The Chilkoot Pass in February was a thing that the word terrible could not contain. Elias had read the accounts in the papers. 3,500 stampeders crossing the pass in a single day, forming an unbroken line of human figures against the white slope, each man carrying 60 to 90 pounds of gear because the Canadian Mounties would not let a man into the Yukon without a year's worth of supplies. He had read the words and understood them intellectually, the way a man reads about drowning when he has never been at sea. The reality was different from the words. The line moved in single file up the golden stairs, 1,500 steps cut into the ice by those who had gone before. And it moved slowly, and it stopped often, and the men in it did not speak, because speech required breath, and breath was what the altitude stole from you first. Elias moved with the line. He had divided his outfit between 3 caches at the base and was making his 4th trip up. His back had begun to speak to him on the 2nd day, a low grinding complaint from somewhere near the base of his spine that he ignored, with the discipline of a man who has been ignoring his body's complaints for decades. His fingers inside his moose-hide mittens had lost feeling in the tips. The cold here was not the cold of Sacramento winters. It was a cold with intent. Around him were men of all kinds, young men from the cities who had sold their furniture and borrowed against their futures, experienced miners who moved with the quiet efficiency of men who knew that mountains did not care about your urgency, foolish men who were clearly going to die, and perhaps 1 or 2 men like himself, old, deliberate, carrying something that was not quite confidence but was not quite doubt either. Just behind him on the stairs was a young man from Portland named Thomas Graves, 24 years old, broad-shouldered, with the kind of cheerful face that the mountains had not yet gotten to work on. He had fallen in beside Elias at the base camp 3 days earlier, as young men sometimes attached themselves to older ones who appeared to know what they were doing. Elias did not know what he was doing, but he had learned long ago that the appearance of knowledge was halfway to the thing itself. "You done this before?" Graves had asked on that first evening around the fire, gesturing vaguely at the immensity of the wilderness around them. "Not this," Elias said. "Other things like it." "I've been reading everything I could find," the young man said. He had an earnest way of looking at you, direct and a little too hopeful, that Elias recognized as the mark of someone who had not yet been thoroughly disappointed. "I got maps. I got a list of the best creeks. Dominion Creek, El Dorado. That's where the big money is. I figure if I can get a claim on one of the tributaries of Bonanza." "Most of the good claims are taken," Elias said. Graves looked at him. "You think so? I know so. The men who got rich in 96 and 97. We're in 98. We're the second wave." He poked at the fire. "Second wave men don't generally strike it rich. They make wages mostly. Some of them make good wages." The young man was quiet for a moment, and Elias watched something move across his face. Not the dying of hope exactly, but its first encounter with resistance. "Then why'd you come?" It was a fair question. Elias looked at the fire and did not answer right away. "Because," he said finally, "a man has to go where the gold is, even when the odds are long, even when he's old, maybe especially when he's old." He paused. "There's a kind of life where you stop trying when the odds go against you, and there's another kind where you don't. I've seen both kinds of men, and only one of them can look at himself in the mirror." Graves had nodded slowly, as though he was filing this away. And then, in the way of young men who have not yet learned to sit with complexity, he changed the subject to food. The summit of the Chilkoot was a kind of victory that felt exactly like defeat. Elias stood at the top and looked north into the Yukon and south into Alaska and understood, for the first time in a physical way, the true scale of what he had undertaken. The valley below him was vast and white and indifferent. The sky had that low pewter quality that means more snow before nightfall. From the pass, the journey to Dawson City was still 500 miles, and this, the crossing of the pass, was the easy part. He was breathing in shallow sips, his heart working harder than it had any right to at this elevation, and the pain in his back had moved from complaint to demand. He thought of Maren. He thought of her face when he had said, At least up there they die, trying for something. In retrospect, that had been both true and needlessly cruel. He made a note to write her a better letter when he reached Dawson. If he reached Dawson. He looked at his hands, the swollen knuckles, the split skin at the fingertips, the permanent ground-in darkness around the nails that 40 years of outdoor work had made a part of him. And he thought about a particular morning in a Nevada mining camp when he had been 35 and had pulled up an empty pan for the 100th time and walked away from the creek, thinking he was done with all of it. He had gone back the next morning. He had always gone back. He was not sure if that was strength or a kind of stubbornness that looked like strength from the outside and was, viewed plainly, something closer to an inability to accept the plainest lessons of experience. But then again, here he was. The lakes and rivers of the upper Yukon froze solid in winter and became, for the stampeder, a highway. Elias and Graves traveled together by this point, by unspoken agreement, neither of them having formally proposed partnership, but both having drifted into it the way men do when the wilderness makes the mathematics of survival clear. 2 men share a fire more efficiently than one. 2 men can pull a sled up a riverbank where one cannot. They made a camp at Lake Bennett while the ice was still too uncertain to travel, and here Elias built what he had observed that experienced men built. A low, dense structure of spruce logs with a good roof and a small stove made from a tin oil drum. Around them, a small city of tents and lean-tos had risen over the winter, stampeders waiting for the ice to break or the freeze to solidify, depending on the season. It was here, over the 2 weeks of waiting, that Elias began to take stock of the people around him. They were of several varieties. There were the genuine miners, men who had worked claims before, who spoke of gravel and bedrock and drift mining in the matter-of-fact way of professionals, who asked practical questions about formation and water rights and the price of lumber in Dawson. There were the speculators, men who intended to buy claims and sell them, who carried ledger books and spoke in terms of investment and return. And there were the dreamers, the hotel clerks and the school teachers and the bank tellers who had read the newspaper accounts and arrived with more imagination than knowledge, who talked about what they would do with their fortune in the warm and detailed way that indicated they had already spent it many times over in their minds. Elias had been all 3 of these in his life, at different times. He was not sure what he was now, something simpler, maybe. A man who had come to find out, to see for himself whether the last great placer field in North America still had something for him. And if not, to have at least looked it in the face. "What do you think you'll find?" Graves asked him one night. The stove was going and they were eating beans that had the specific, sacred quality of hot food in a cold place. "Gold," Elias said. "Maybe. And if not gold, then the answer." "What's the question?" Elias considered. Whether I was the kind of man who could have done it. Whether I had it in me. He ate a spoonful of beans. "I've been asking that question for 40 years. It's time I got an answer." Graves looked at him with those young, direct eyes. "And if the answer's no?" "Then I'll know," Elias said. And there's something to be said for knowing. The Yukon River ice broke in May, and the fleet of homemade boats, 500 of them, 7,000 people, swept down toward Dawson in the spring flood. Elias had built his boat over the long winter from spruce lumber, a flat-bottomed craft 16 feet long, and he had learned what he could from the men around him about navigating the river's moods. The Miles Canyon and the White Horse Rapids were the great dangers, standing waves and a narrow gorge of volcanic rock, where dozens of boats had already been wrecked and several men drowned. The Mounties had established a rule that women and men of uncertain seamanship must walk around the canyon. But Elias stood at the mouth of the gorge for a long time, reading the water. and then said to Graves, who was watching him, "I'll go through." He went through. The boat bucked and the water came over the bow, and Elias held the sweep oar with both hands, and the muscles in his shoulders sang with effort. And for the 3 minutes of the canyon, he was not 60 years old, but ageless, reduced to the pure present tense of a man fighting water. Nothing before and nothing after. Only the roaring walls and the green surge and the necessity of keeping the bow straight. When he shot out into the calm water below, he was laughing. He could not have explained the laughter. It came from somewhere below the thinking parts. Graves had walked around the canyon, which was entirely sensible, and met him on the far bank with an expression of something between admiration and fear. "You're crazy," the young man said. "Probably," Elias agreed. He did not say what he felt, which was that those 3 minutes in the canyon had been worth the entire journey. The dead mule, the cold, the bad back, all of it. There are moments in old age when the body briefly forgets what year it is, and that had been one of them. Dawson City. In the summer of 1898 was a place of such extravagant contradiction that Elias simply stopped trying to reconcile its parts and accepted it whole. It was a city of 12,000 people, built on permafrost, at the junction of the Yukon and Klondike rivers. A place where you could buy champagne and fresh oysters if you had the gold, and where men were dying of scurvy in the streets if you did not. The saloons ran 24 hours a day. The dance halls charged $1 a minute for the company of women, who danced with the specific professional neutrality of those who have understood commerce from an early age. Fortunes were made and spent in the same evening. Men who had arrived with everything left with nothing, and men who had arrived with nothing sometimes left with everything, and there seemed to be no reliable correlation between intelligence, effort, or virtue, and which of these outcomes a man received. Elias bought a grubstake outfit from a merchant who was clearly charging double what it was worth, and he found his way to the creeks. The creek valleys of the Klondike watershed were studded with claims numbered from discovery outward. Above discovery, below discovery. Each claim, 500 feet of creek bed with the accompanying hillside. Most of the good creek bed claims were indeed taken, as Elias had told Graves they would be. But he had been watching and listening, and what he had learned over the winter was that the real opportunity in 1898 was in the bench claims, the ancient creek beds high up on the valley walls, left behind when the river cut its modern channel deeper into the earth, carrying their ancient pay streak in gravel that lay frozen and untouched sometimes 60 or 80 feet above the current creek. Bench mining was slower work than creek mining. It required sinking shafts through frozen gravel, using fires and steam thaw to melt the permafrost, hauling gravel to the surface by hand. It required patience and physical endurance. It was not the work of young men in a hurry. It was the work of men who had spent their lives learning that the earth gave up its wealth slowly and reluctantly and on its own schedule, not yours. Elias staked a bench claim on the left limit of Dominion Creek and began to work. The first weeks were about building the infrastructure of extraction, a small cabin, a system for melting the permafrost with steam points fed by a wood-fired boiler, a sluice box for processing gravel. Graves helped him for a time before departing to try his luck on El Dorado, where a man from Seattle had assured him the ground was still paying. Elias worked mostly alone. Working alone at 60 is different from working alone at 30. At 30, solitude is a simple fact. At 60, it is a conversation. Elias found himself talking to the work, to the frozen gravel, to the steam that rose from the thawed ground in cold morning air, to the sluice box, filling with material that might contain something or might contain nothing. He talked to his dead wife, whose name had been Clara, who had died of fever in 1887 and whose absence had shaped the last 11 years of his life, the way a missing tooth shapes the tongue's wandering. He talked occasionally to his daughter Maren, practicing the things he should have said instead of the things he had said. He found, after 3 weeks, his first color. It was a few small flakes in the riffles of the sluice box. Not enough to weigh, barely enough to see, but unmistakably gold, with that specific quality of yellowness that no other substance on earth quite achieves. He had seen that color hundreds of times in his life, and it never failed to do something to him, somewhere in the chest, a physical tightening that was not quite joy, but was adjacent to it. He did not whoop. He did not dance. He crouched over the sluice box in the afternoon light and looked at the color for a long time. And then he carefully cleaned the riffles into his pan and weighed what he had. And what he had was perhaps 15 cents worth of gold dust. But the color was there. The pay streak was there, somewhere below him in the bench gravel. He kept digging. By August, he had sunk 3 shafts to bedrock and had drifted laterally through the frozen gravel, following the color as it strengthened and led him deeper into the old hillside. He had hired a man to help him for 2 weeks, a Norwegian named Sven, who was built like a draft horse and who worked without complaint and without conversation, which Elias found deeply restful. And together they had moved more gravel than Elias could have managed alone. The claim was paying. Not paying like El Dorado, where a single pan had once yielded $800, but paying in the steady, modest way of a creek that has gold throughout, rather than in pockets. He was averaging $4 to $6 a day, good wages for the work. At that rate, he calculated, he would return to Sacramento with perhaps $1,200 above his expenses, enough to buy a small house, enough to not be a burden to Marin, not enough to be rich. He sat with this calculation one evening and waited for the disappointment to arrive. It did not quite arrive. What arrived instead was something more complicated. A feeling that he could not immediately name, which on examination turned out to be a form of satisfaction. He had come. He had found the creek. He had worked it correctly, reading the formation, following the bench, taking the gravel methodically to bedrock. He had not broken his body past its limits, though he had taken it close to them. He had made the passage through the canyon. He had done, in other words, what he had come to find out, whether he could do. He wrote a letter to Marin. It was a long letter, and in it, he said things he had not been able to say in person. About her mother, about the years he had worked for other men, about why he needed to make this trip, even though she was right that it was dangerous and possibly foolish and certainly the act of a man who did not fully understand his own age. He told her that the bench was paying in a modest way and that he expected to come home before the freeze with something to show for it. He told her that he was well and that he slept well and that the cold and the work had given him a clarity he had not felt in years. He told her that he was sorry for what he had said about dying, trying. He sent the letter out on the next packet to Skagway and felt, after it was gone, considerably lighter. September came to the Klondike like a sentence. The cold returned overnight, and with it the understanding, not intellectual but physical, in the way the permafrost telegraphed itself up through his boots, that the season was ending. Men around him began the calculations of departure. How much gravel could be moved before the ground locked up again, whether to winter in Dawson or make the journey out before the passes closed. What the balance sheet said. Elias had 1 drift left to run. He could feel it in the way the color had been strengthening. The pay streak was bending north under the hillside, and if his reading of the formation was correct, it was going to intersect a richer deposit somewhere beneath him. Every miner's instinct he had accumulated over 40 years was telling him that he was 30 feet from something significantly better than what he'd been finding. He had perhaps 3 weeks before the ground froze solid. He went into the shaft early on a Monday morning with a steam point and a drift candle, and he worked without stopping until the light ran out, and then he came up and ate and slept and went down again. The Norwegian had left 2 weeks earlier for Dawson and the boat south, and Elias worked alone, the way he had begun, the way he suspected he would end most things. On the 4th day, in the afternoon, the drift broke into a gravel layer he had not seen before. Older, darker, packed with the fine black sand that sometimes indicated a primordial creek bottom. He brought his candle close. He brushed the material with his fingers and held it to the light. The gold was there, not in flakes but in grains, scattered densely through the black sand, and in one place a piece the size of a small apple seed, dull yellow and perfect. He sat down in the dirt of the drift in the candlelight and looked at what he had found. Later, when he tried to describe this moment to Maren, he found that he did not have the right words for it. It was not triumph exactly. It was more like recognition. The feeling of arriving at a place you have always known existed, even when you could not have described where it was or how to get there. The fever, which had lived in his chest for so long that he had stopped being aware of it as a separate thing, was suddenly quiet. Not extinguished, but satisfied. For the first time in memory, the needle of the compass was still. He cleaned the face of the drift carefully and bagged his samples, and climbed out of the shaft into the September cold. And the air hit his face and the valley opened around him, the birch trees already gold, and the spruce dark green against the hill, and the river below, catching the afternoon light. And he stood there for a while, doing nothing except looking at it. He reached Skagway in late October, with the first real snow on the passes. He had cleared the gravel from the rich pocket over 2 hard weeks, working with a focused urgency that he had not known he still possessed, taking it to bedrock and sluicing every yard of it. And what he had was a poke that weighed just over 14 pounds, gold dust and small nuggets, which at current Dawson prices translated to something over $2,800, considerably more than he had calculated in August. Not a fortune by Klondike standards, but by the standards of a 60-year-old man from Sacramento who had started with 11 years' savings and a mule. It was remarkable. He had encountered graves on the Dawson waterfront, looking thinner and sadder and considerably wiser. El Dorado had yielded wages but not wealth. The man from Seattle had been selling optimism, not information. Graves was going home to Portland with enough to clear his debts and not much else, but he carried himself differently, with the particular gravity of a man who has been tested and not entirely found wanting. They shook hands on the dock. "You find what you were looking for?" Graves asked. Elias thought about this for a moment. "Found some of it," he said. "Enough." "Enough is good," the young man said. "Yes," Elias agreed. "Enough is very good." There are 2 ways to tell the story of Elias Croft's last fever.
In the first version, he is a 60-year-old man who ignored sensible advice and spent his savings to risk his life in a country designed to kill him, who crossed a death pass and ran a dangerous canyon and worked himself to the edge of his body's tolerance in frozen ground for months, and who came home with $2,800 when he might have sat in Sacramento and made wages in perfect safety.
In this version, it is a story about a man who did not understand the odds or refused to accept them. A story about the fine and perhaps fatal line between courage and stubbornness, between perseverance and delusion.
You can read the life of Elias Croft and see a man who never learned the lesson that the earth keeps teaching, which is that it will not be compelled to yield its wealth to any particular person, simply because that person desires it or feels entitled to it or has dreamed of it for 40 years. In the second version, he is a man who knew exactly what he was doing and exactly what it cost, and paid the price with his eyes open because he had made a calculation that went like this. The years are numbered, and the opportunities within them are fewer still, and a man who reaches the end having tried nothing because the odds were long has not been safe. He has been merely absent from his own life. In this version,
The $2,800 is not the point. The 3 minutes in the canyon are the point. The drift candle in the frozen hill are the point. The letter to Maren, which she read 3 times and wept over and kept in the kitchen drawer for the rest of her life, is the point. Elias himself, when asked, and he was asked many times in the Sacramento barbershop where he went for the rest of his years to get his white hair trimmed, never chose between these 2 versions. He would describe what he had done and let the listener decide which story they were hearing. He seemed to find this arrangement satisfactory. What he did say once to a young man who was planning his own journey north and who asked whether it was worth it was this: "There are 2 kinds of fevers. One is the fever for gold, and that one mostly kills you or disappoints you. The other is the fever to know what you are, and that one—" He paused and looked out the barbershop window at the Sacramento street, the ordinary morning traffic of a city that did not know or particularly care about the Klondike. That one is worth running hot for as long as God gives you the blood to sustain it. He went home to the small house he had bought with the proceeds of the bench claim and sat on the porch in the afternoon light. And his daughter came on Sundays now, and they spoke warmly, and the mule was still dead, and the years continued in their diminishment. And Elias Croft, who had stood at the summit of the Chilkoot Pass and looked north and chosen to keep walking, found that this, all of this, was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The Klondike. Gold rush of 1896 to 1899 drew an estimated 100,000 prospectors to the Yukon. Of these, perhaps 30,000 reached Dawson City. Fewer than 4,000 found any gold. Fewer than a few hundred became genuinely wealthy. The ground did not care about any of them. It gave up what it gave up and kept the rest. The men who went anyway were not fools. Or they were fools in the particular and necessary way that all great human endeavors require. Willing to bet against the odds, because the alternative, the long, safe, opting out, seemed to them a worse kind of loss. The last fever is not the hunger for gold. It is the hunger to be, until the very end, alive in the fullest sense of the word. Tested, present, committed, unresigned. Some men are cured of it early. The lucky ones carry it to their graves.